Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining me. It is a Wednesday, and there's so much going on, other things I really want to talk about, but I'll just have to get to some of this stuff in the next video because I wanted to pause today and reflect on the life and death of Jimmy Swaggart, the minister from Louisiana, because no matter how you feel about him, he had a truly fascinating life. And it makes for a really compelling story. And I've got a little bit of inside baseball on his life that I want to share with you. Maybe I'll tell you things you didn't know about Jimmy Swaggart. You may have never heard of the man. That's okay too. There may be some things you believe about him that are not correct. I don't know. We'll see. I'll tell you what I know about him. Because again, it makes for a really compelling story. Now, Jimmy Swaggart was born in 1935 in a tiny little town called Faraday, Louisiana. Really small town. And his mother was a woman by the name of Minnie Bell. And his father, he had a nickname. His nickname was Son, but his actual name was Willie Leon. And Willie Leon was a sharecropper, but he was also a fiddle player. So they brought Jimmy up in poverty, basically. And one of the fascinating parts of the story of Jimmy Swaggart is, of course, as many, if not most of you will know, he had a couple of really famous cousins as well. This was there was some really serious music being birthed around Faraday, Louisiana, down on the Mississippi Delta, if you will. A lot of great artists came from that neck of the woods. And Jimmy was cousins, of course, with one of the, I guess you could call him a pioneer of rock and roll. Jerry Lee Lewis was his cousin, as well as Mickey Gilley, who was a country music performer primarily, and a bar owner. So they were all three related. They were all cousins, and all three, Jimmy, Jerry Lee, and Mickey, I believe Jerry Lee was the oldest, they all three pretty much self-taught themselves on the piano, and they all played this honky-tonk style of piano, and they were all raised here in this section of the country in Louisiana. Now, in the late 1950s, a lot of people don't know this, but they were all raised. Let me stop. Jimmy and Jerry Lee. It's actually Jimmy Lee as well. Jimmy Lee and Jerry Lee. I don't know what Mickey's middle name was. But Jimmy and Jerry Lee were both raised in the Assemblies of God Protestant denomination. Now, the Assemblies of God is a part of the Pentecostal sect within Christendom. It's a Protestant denomination. They have about 3 million adherents in the United States. This is my kind of connection with the Swaggart story because I was raised in this particular denomination myself. So I kind of know what the background is for these gentlemen. But as he got older, Jerry Lee would actually play the piano in church as well as Jimmy. But Jerry Lee went to Bible college. A lot of people don't know that. Jerry Lee Lewis went to Bible college in Texas, and he enrolled at the Southwest Assemblies of God Bible College. And while he was there as a student, he would play gospel music in his honky-tonk style, and that got him in hot water because the powers that be at his Bible college did not. Now, you remember this is the mid-1950s, and Jerry Lee is basically playing his Great Balls of Fire brand of rockabilly piano to gospel favorites, and the powers that be at the Bible college didn't like it, and they kicked him out. They booted him out. This was before Jimmy became a minister, of course. So at that point, Jerry Lee made his way eventually to Memphis, where he, in similar fashion to Elvis Presley, ran into Sam Phillips at Sun Record Studio, and the rest is history. He signed a record deal, and he began playing his style of rockabilly music, and he had big hits such as Great Balls of Fire and many others. A whole lot of shaking going on, and so he became kind of, I guess you could say, the black sheep of the family. But in the mid 1950s, Jerry Lee Lewis was making $20,000 a week. Now I don't want to get sidetracked on the Jerry Lee so much because this is about Jimmy, but Jerry Lee was white hot, and his career took a nosedive when he married his 13-year-old cousin Myra. Some of you may remember that, but I digress. Let me get back to Jimmy. Jimmy's devotion was to God, and he had determined that he was going to be a preacher. That's what he wanted to do. As a matter of fact, he would also meet Sam Phillips at Sun Record Studios in Memphis, and Sam Phillips wanted to sign Jimmy as well because he wanted him to play gospel music on the Sun label. And Jimmy, to his credit, demonstrating his devotion and his dedication, he refused and said no, he wanted to go and preach the gospel, and that's what he did. And so he was very poor initially. He didn't stay poor, but he started out very poor. And he, at the age of 17, married a 15-year-old woman from nearby, not in Faraday, Louisiana, but nearby in another small town. And that was Frances, and Frances became his wife. She was 15 years old when they married, and later on they would have a son, their only child, whose name is Donnie Swaggart. So Jerry Lee went on to have his career in rock and roll. Mickey Gilley came along a little bit later, and he had his career in country music, and they were all very successful. All three of these men sold millions of record albums. But it was in 1960, after traveling the back roads of the South and just barely scratching out a living, that Jimmy started pursuing radio and preaching his sermons and singing songs on radio and playing the piano. He had all three of these men had very good musical talents on the piano, but they could also sing as well. Jimmy may have been the best singer of all of them. Who knows? That's for you to decide. But he starts preaching and singing on the radio in the early 1960s, in 1960 actually. And in 1961, the year of my birth, he was ordained a minister in the aforementioned Assemblies of God denomination. And from there, he just started doing his revival meetings throughout the South. And he began to get more and more, his fame began to grow more and more. Until the year 1970. In 1970, Jimmy kind of, he was still doing his radio work, but then he got on TV and he started doing television work as well. So now he's doing radio and television, and this became popular, and it began to grow and grow. And you may remember in America back in the 1970s, there were several TV evangelists who began around that time, and some of them became very successful. You had men such as Oral Roberts from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Robert Schuller in California, and James Kennedy in Florida, and on and on and on it goes. Rex Humbard. And on it went, and this is what Jimmy was doing as well. And he began to be very successful both in his meetings. He was in demand. His recordings were selling very well, and he was doing very well in his media enterprises as well. And it was about this time that he went and purchased land in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and somewhere in that time period, he also started a little local church that became to be known as the Family Worship Center, which kind of served as his home base. But he continued to grow in popularity, and by the 1980s, Jimmy Swaggart was going all over the world, and he was commanding crowds in stadiums in Billy Graham style, preaching and singing to thousands and tens of thousands of people, pardon me. And he was very successful. And he began to, and he continued to purchase land in and around Baton Rouge, and he began to build his ministry headquarters there in Baton Rouge, eventually beginning a Bible college that bore his name, the Jimmy Swaggart Bible College, which is still there on Bluebonnet Drive in Baton Rouge. I've been there, been by there. Now, Jimmy Swaggart in the mid-1980s was as popular as just about any other minister on television. There were a lot of them on television in the 1980s that were very popular and very, very highly rated in terms of their viewership, and they began to rake in millions of dollars into their ministries. I've already mentioned some of the names that became popular in this time frame. Another name you may remember, a little blast from the past, was Jim Bakker. Jim Bakker you may remember the PTL Club. Well, Jim Bakker was as Swaggart. He was also an ordained minister in the Assemblies of God Protestant denomination. But they were rivals. There was also Pat Robertson in Virginia Beach, and Jerry Falwell in Lynchburg, Virginia, and all these different names. Some of them I've mentioned already. And so it was almost like a competition. It was almost like seeing who could get the biggest ratings and make the most money. And these ministries were taking in multiplied millions of dollars, all because they wanted to continue to finance their delivery of what they called the gospel, and to build their respective properties. The PTL Club or Heritage USA in Charlotte, North Carolina, that was Jim Bakker, and on and on and on it goes. And all of these ministries were reaching their peak in the 1980s, and then scandal hit. And you may remember this. In 1986 or 87, it was in this time period, there was a moral failing that affected several of these ministries. And I'll start for the moment because it's all relevant and germane to the story. Jim and Tammy Bakker were at the Heritage USA, the PTL Club, and the Heritage USA theme park that they built right outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, at its peak was the second best attended amusement park in America, second only to Disney World in Orlando, Florida. It was huge. They had over $4 million visitors per year, and they were raking in millions of dollars because Jim Bakker was very good, folks, at raising money. But Jim Bakker had a moral failure, and many of you know about this, where he had a brief dalliance with a church secretary by the name of Jessica Hahn, and his ministry paid her about $235,000 in hush money so that she wouldn't talk about it. But as you might assume, it all blew up in their faces, and things went belly up with Jim Bakker and PTL fairly quickly, Jerry Falwell was actually brought in to kind of try and right the ship, but there was so much financial mismanagement, and Jim Bakker was eventually charged with a lot of federal charges, such as mail fraud, wire fraud, things of this nature. The general consensus was he didn't go to jail because of his affair. He went to jail because of financial mismanagement, basically. The general consensus was he was overselling condos, which was basically a timeshare operation that he had going. And he went to prison, but he wasn't the only one to get into trouble. So let's get back from Bakker, by the way, I'll just go ahead and insert here. Bakker is still alive. He's in his 80s. He's living now in Blue Eye, Missouri. His wife, Tammy, died several years ago, but Bakker remarried. He's still on some obscure television network, and he's out there pushing a message of the end times and selling survival food and survival supplies of all manner of that you can think of. So he's still around. But this is what happened with Jimmy Swaggart in the 1980s, and he was as big and hot and famous as just about any other TV preacher that was out there. This is where I kind of began to insert myself into the story. Not that I had any personal doings with any of these people. My connection to this is via a religious affiliation, and this is where I kind of let some of you in on something about my life that you don't know that I'm going to share with you right now, because it's somewhat germane to the relevance of the story. Jimmy Swaggart was raised in the Assemblies of God. Jim Bakker was raised in the Assemblies of God. Marvin Gorman, a man I'm about to tell you about, was raised in the Assemblies of God. Jerry Lee Lewis was raised in the Assemblies of God Protestant denomination. Elvis Presley was raised in the Assemblies of God, and so was I. And I was brought up in this sect of Christianity, of Christendom. And that's what I knew, that's what I believed. I'm not going to get too much into theological matters right now, just to give you some background on this and tell you that when I kind of came of age, kind of like Jerry Lee Lewis, I went to an Assemblies of God college myself, this one being in Florida, and eventually I was ordained myself into the Assemblies of God in the year 1986. Interesting, right? Now, not to get sidetracked here, but I had a crisis of faith, you could call it, beginning in the late 1980s, when all of these scandals began to take place, and I left behind ultimately all forms of Protestantism, and I embraced what I believe to be the church, the Orthodox Church. And I was baptized into the Orthodox Church in 1999. And of course, what we believe in Orthodox Christianity is at tremendous variance with anything that would be taught in the Assemblies of God denomination or any other Protestant denomination for that much. But this is what happened to Swaggart beginning around the year 1986. I was ordained in May of 1986 in Albany, Georgia, in the style of the Assemblies of God. I'm not ordained anymore. I had to leave all that behind. But the special speaker for this service was to be a man by the name of, you got it, Jimmy Swaggart. Well, at the last minute, Jimmy Swaggart had to cancel, and for whatever reason, and he was replaced by another somewhat famous preacher in the denomination by the name of David Wilkerson. You may have heard of him. He wrote a book called The Cross and the Switchblade, and many other books. So that's how that went. That August of that year, I traveled with a good buddy of mine to San Antonio, Texas, because every 2 years the Assemblies of God denomination had what's called their General Council Convention. It's where all of their ministers would convene, and all of their hierarchy would convene in a place somewhere in the United States for their biannual convention, and they would have elections and discuss rules and bylaws and things of this nature. And so it was in San Antonio, Texas. Now, about this time in San Antonio, Texas, and it was in August, and it was hot, let me tell you. And I said, hey, I've always heard Texas had really good chili, so Mr. Einstein here is eating Texas chili on the Riverwalk in San Antonio. Why, I don't know, but anyway, you'll figure. There was another minister in the Assemblies of God at this time who was based out of New Orleans, Louisiana, and his name was Marvin Gorman. Now, Marvin Gorman also had somewhat of a television presence, nowhere near the magnitude of a Swaggart or a Roberts or a Baker, anyone like that. But he was still fairly popular, at least within the Pentecostal movement. But there was, for some reason, perhaps geography had something to do with it, but there was enmity, if you will, between Marvin Gorman and Jimmy Swaggart. Marvin Gorman died 4 or 5 years ago, but they didn't like each other at all. They were really a rivalry between each other. Marvin Gorman was greatly successful as pastor of First Assembly of God in New Orleans. He grew the church to several thousand people, and he was in demand all over. He was a tremendous orator. I went to some of his services, and I at the time I said, I've never heard anybody like this. He was the best preacher, I said at the time, that I'd ever heard, and I still maintain he's one of the most fantastic orators I ever heard. He was absolutely tremendous, had tremendous command in terms of public speaking. But Jimmy Swaggart didn't like him, and Jimmy Swaggart brought accusations about Gorman. Whether they are true or not, I do not know. That Gorman was having several affairs, extramarital affairs. Now, within the Assemblies of God at this particular time, Gorman was hot, as was Swaggart, as you can imagine. And at this particular convention in 1986, everyone who was in attendance was going to be voting for a new leader for the Assemblies of God denomination, what we call a general superintendent. The previous superintendent, Thomas Zimmerman, was retiring, and we were electing a new superintendent to run the denomination. And when all the first ballot votes were in, we had Marvin Gorman's name was at the top of the list. At the top of the list, right behind him was Jimmy Swaggart, of all people. But we were told that by the administration, and there's like 20,000 people in this arena, this big sports arena in San Antonio, and we were told that Swaggart had called in. He wasn't there, but he had called in and asked that his name be removed. But that's not all he did. Somebody made a privileged motion from the floor, and it was Marvin Gorman, who was in attendance. And I was feeling like that he was a shoo-in to be the next superintendent, because on the first ballot of voting, he got way more votes than anybody else. But he stood before the assembly there weeping and talking in a very cryptic manner, basically denying what he had been accused of. And a lot of us are looking around going, what's he talking about? Well, we find out later that Jimmy Swaggart had called the hierarchy at the convention and told them that if Marvin Gorman did not remove his name from the ballot, that he was going to expose the affairs that Gorman was having with all these other women. And that's what that was all about. And so Gorman left the convention that year and went back to his pastorate, and another man who was basically the assistant superintendent was elected. And I tell you that because it's important to this story. So stick with me. Now, after that happened, Marvin Gorman filed a successful lawsuit against Jimmy Swaggart for defamation and conspiracy to ruin his reputation. He was awarded damages in 1981 of $10 million, but after there was an appeal, the Swaggarts and the Gormans settled for $1.7 million, which Swaggart had to pay to Gorman. But Gorman wasn't done with Swaggart. As a retaliation against Swaggart, Marvin Gorman hired his son-in-law, whose name was Randy, or rather he hired his son, Randy, and his son-in-law, who was a man by the name of Garland Bilbo, to start watching Jimmy Swaggart's movements, which they did. And they started basically, unbeknownst to Jimmy Swaggart, they started following Jimmy Swaggart. And one night they followed Jimmy Swaggart, unbeknownst to him, to the Travel Inn on Airline Highway in Metairie, which is a suburb of New Orleans. And at the Travel Inn, Randy and Garland photographed Jimmy outside of motel room number 7 with a prostitute by the name of Deborah Murphy. And they got out of their car and went to Jimmy Swaggart's Lincoln Continental, and they let the air out of his tires. So when Jimmy Swaggart exited the motel room, he was distraught to find that he had 4 flat tires. A car pulled up behind his Lincoln Continental with 4 flat tires, and out of the car stepped Marvin Gorman, who said, "Hello, Jimmy." Now, after this happened, they just sat down in the car, and Jimmy was very repentant to Marvin Gorman about what he had done. I need to get a sip of water. Bear with me. Okay, so because of the allegations against Gorman by Swaggart, the Assemblies of God defrocked Marvin Gorman. And this was Gorman getting back at Swaggart. And he said, "Here's where we are, Jimmy. If you will go and publicly apologize for your accusations against me, I will never say anything about this again, but you also have to call the Assemblies of God and ask them to reinstate me as a minister in the denomination." And Swaggart agreed, according to Gorman, to do this. So Gorman waited a year, and Swaggart never did it. And it was at that time that Gorman went to the Assemblies of God hierarchy in Springfield, Missouri, with photos. This was in 1988. I'm sorry, 88 and 89 with the photos. I believe by this time Baker had already been deposed himself. And so he goes and says to the hierarchy of the Assemblies of God, "Here's your boy." And that's when things really went south. Because he had been exposed, and because there was no denying what had happened, some of you may remember that Jimmy Swaggart stood before he came off the road, canceled all of his crusades, stood in the pulpit of his home church, and he delivered that famous "I have sinned" speech. And then he was suspended by the Louisiana District of the Assemblies of God for 3 months, and then the main hierarchy of the Assemblies of God, they suspended him. I believe it was going to be for 1 year, but that didn't work out too well. Now, what happened after that? Well, Jimmy, I need more water. Okay, so all this happened in 1988. I had to check my date on that, and that was right, 1988. So after his little speech of repentance before his church in Baton Rouge, the hierarchy of the Assemblies of God were going to suspend him for a year, and this is where Jimmy bucked the discipline And he basically came up with the excuse that I've got to keep preaching the gospel. I can't take any time off because souls are at stake and all this, yada, yada, yada. And so he was defrocked from the Assemblies of God. So they defrocked Marvin Gorman, they defrocked Jim Baker, they defrocked Jimmy Swaggart. They never defrocked me. I left voluntarily on good terms. And so now Jimmy Swaggart is basically out there doing his own thing until his death, actually. He never sought affiliation with any other denomination, any other movement. It was just him and his family worship center. Like, so many groups in America that have no particular religious, they're like a denomination of one. It's basically the Jimmy Swaggart denomination, and it stayed that way until his death. Of course, when all of this upheaval happened, he lost a huge amount of his following that he never regained. He canceled all of his crusades that were moneymakers, but he still kept a core audience, and that sustained him in his ministry up until his death. Now, that wasn't the end of things. In 1991, in October of 1991, once again, Jimmy Swaggart was found in the company of a prostitute in California. This is the second time he'd been confronted about this. He was pulled over by a police officer in Indio, California for driving on the wrong side of the road, and there he was found to be in the company of a woman by the name of Rosemary Garcia, a prostitute. And she told everybody what had happened there. And this time, instead of doing a speech of repentance before his church, when all of this came out, this scandal came out, rather than confessing his sins again to his congregation, Swaggart told the people at the Family Worship Center, quote, "The Lord told me it's flat, none of your business," unquote. And then he temporarily stepped down for a time of healing and counseling, blah, blah, blah. And then he came back, and he stayed there until his death on Tuesday. Never really successfully dealing with the issues that he obviously had. I'm not here to scandalize Jimmy Swaggart any more than he's already been scandalized, but he could have handled the whole thing so much better than he actually did. The best thing I maintain that Swaggart could have done would have been to simply be honest and take his medicine from the denominational hierarchy and do what they said. And that way he could at least, a little humble pie would have served him very well. If he had simply confessed and said, whatever you want me to do, that's what I'll do. That's what he should have done in the first place, if you ask me. But he was too stubborn to do what those that were in authority over him. And there's a great lesson here, folks. I really believe that, because we all should be under some sort of an authority, if you ask me, so that there will be accountability in our lives, Jimmy Swaggart needed a priest. Jimmy Swaggart needed somebody he could confess his sins to, because this is something he never really, as of 1991, it was just a passion he was never really able to conquer, and he tried to do it by himself. And it's really a sad thing, a sad ordeal. But he kept going, and in Baton Rouge, eventually having the bulk of the pastoral work taken over by his son Donnie, who I assume is going to take over the entire ministry now. Jimmy died Tuesday after suffering a heart attack about 3 weeks ago, and he succumbed to his heart attack last Tuesday morning, and he was 90 years old. He was preceded in death by Jerry Lee Lewis, and then by Mickey Gilley, and they all died probably within 2 or 3 years of each other. I think Jerry Lee died no more than 2 years ago, so they all lived to a ripe old age. 3 really talented men, 3 really popular men, 3 men who really had a big hand in the development of American music, with their honky-tonk style of playing and singing. That was Jimmy Swaggart. So there you have it. Maybe something you didn't know, and that's his story. My prayer is that the Lord simply would have mercy on him and have mercy on us all. All right, there you have it, folks. We'll get back to regular programming on the next video. Comment down below. I'd like to hear your thoughts about Jimmy Swaggart, Jerry Lee Lewis, any of these guys. Make sure you like the video. I would greatly appreciate that, and subscribe to the channel if you have not yet. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll see you soon.